So Emmanuel Macron has been shocking the the whole geopolitical scene, the defense community, diplomats all across the world, both within Russia, within Europe, and probably outside of Europe as well. I know in the United States, by coming forward and openly floating the idea of deploying French troops to Ukraine. And now it hasn't just been the French who have been floating it. After they opened up the gates, there have been a few other countries, like some Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, some diplomatic overtures, which also seem to somewhat float the idea. And now we're even hearing some rumblings from Poland, but France is the one steaming ahead at the tip of the spear, talking about it again and again and again. And not just anyone's talking about it, Emmanuel Macron is talking about it. And Emmanuel Macron is the president of France. And while everybody should know that, one thing about the role of the president of France is that when it comes to foreign policy, it's actually quite similar to the president of the United States, in the idea that the president of France is the commander-in-chief of the French armed forces in the same way that the president of the United States is. And because of that, and other reasons as well, he gets large flexibility in being able to manage French foreign policy as the French president, meaning that positions from him are particularly significant. And so he has been floating the idea of sending troops to Ukraine and has been pretty steadfast about the idea that Ukraine has to win, Russia cannot win. This is something he's drawing in the line, and he's been saying again and again and again that the way that the West has dealt with red lines has not been productive, and it's slowed us down. We said we got to send the tanks, then we can't send the tanks, then we sent the tanks. And it seems that it doesn't make sense for us to draw red lines when the Russians don't draw red lines for themselves. For example, the deployment of troops in Ukraine. So it's not a commitment to deploying troops in Ukraine or anything like that. It's a commitment to strategic ambiguity towards deploying troops in Ukraine so the Russians could reconsider. But it could also be the start of deploying training troops, air defense units, or possibly border patrol units to protect the Ukrainian border with, say, Belarus, in order to free up manpower to go help the front, since the Ukrainians are dealing with manpower shortages and talking about how they're going to manage large-scale mobilization. So there is a possibility that it could lead to, French troops working in Ukraine doing training operations. But when people think of combat troops on the front line, he has yet to, or any European leader or American leader or supporter of Ukraine, float the idea of sending combat troops to the front line outside of some disastrous scenario, which, for example, Emmanuel Macron is pushing towards, which is the idea of, if Russia looks like there's going to be a large-scale breakthrough and they're going to take somewhere like Odessa and Kiev, well, maybe in that situation. Now, this strategic ambiguity seems to make I think if you were to ask me, right? Now, of course, I'm not the #1 expert on all French affairs, but it's to make the Russians think twice. And it is, I think, to probe somewhat in this direction to see what areas of flexibility they can work with. Because, like we've talked about, first, the tanks. You couldn't send the tanks over to Ukraine. Then the tanks got sent. Oh, well, you can't send the jets over to Ukraine. Then the jets got sent. And so it seems like now maybe this is the probing of, oh, we couldn't send any troops over to Ukraine. Now we can send training troops. So whether it is to create more flexibility so they can move towards that direction, to make the Russians think twice, or just to make it so he's in a more diplomatically flexible position. So even if he wouldn't send troops in the event that the Russians break through the Kiev, it could make them reconsider and could stop them from pursuing that goal if they just think the French might intervene, because fighting the French along with the Ukrainians, or the French along with the Poles and the Ukrainians, is going to be a much harder task for the Russians. And so the Russians, of course, have responded to all this by saying the entrance of NATO troops into the war in Ukraine will inevitably lead to a war between Russia and NATO. But it's hard for me to know, and it's hard for me to believe with certainty, that if there were training troops in Lviv training Ukrainian soldiers in how to storm trenches, that necessarily starts a Russian invasion of Estonia. If you can't beat the Ukrainians, how are you going to beat all of NATO? That's a problem that they would have to think about. So unless they would do some big escalation to try to scare the West off, it would put them in a very difficult position. Anyway, we've talked about this a lot. You've heard some of my thoughts, some of my, some of the things that have been bouncing around my head. Let's now watch Macron talk to 2 French reporters, which are going to impress him on the idea of sending French troops to Ukraine.
I chose to speak to you during the 24 hours of our 2 channels to clarify your position on our commitment to Ukraine. On February 26, after an international conference, you stunned everyone by refusing to rule out sending Western troops to Ukraine. A few days later, you called on Europeans not to be cowards. Finally, you stated that there were no limits, no red lines to French support for Kiev. So, have we understood you correctly?
By the way, this is an AI translation, so it's not 100% going to be perfect, but I've asked French speakers and they say it is basically 100%, or not basically, but nearly perfect. It's interesting because at certain points in the interview, they sound angrier than I think they actually are in the interaction. But this is the type of work AI should actually be doing, like instantly translating into like one language to another so people can communicate. This is the type of, I don't want to be mean to translators, but say somewhat like grunt work that I would like to see AI, be used and utilized for. Definitely, as a content creator, has to translate a lot of stuff, or pay people to translate a lot of stuff.
Considering sending Western French troops to Ukraine?
Good evening and welcome. You're sitting in front of me. Are you standing? No. Are you ruling out standing up at the end of this interview?
Debate 1, over. Macron can get up and just leave now. It's over. He just described strategic ambiguity in 2 seconds. Sorry, continuing. I thought it was a good way to open the interview, personally. It's a good way to explain it. It's kind of funny, though.
Of course, you're not going to rule it out. You won't rule it out. There you go. We're not sure we'll do it, but in any case, we're not in that situation today.
It's not a question of life or death. It's a question of sitting or dying.
No, but first, there's a gradation, and it depends where you're doing it. I make this comparison to explain what it means not to exclude options. There's a reason for not doing it. And the position of simply saying what we're doing and giving ourselves red lines. What's the situation? For the last 10 years, because this all started in 2014, Russia launched a war of aggression against Ukraine. Then we did everything we could to establish peace. Everything. The Minsk agreements.
200 rounds of negotiation. 200 negotiated ceasefires. 20 negotiated ceasefires before the 2022 invasion. Yeah, they talked. They talked quite a lot. They talked for about 8 years. They negotiated for about 8 years. 200 rounds, 20 rounds. Yeah, no, they certainly talked. There's a lot of talking, a lot less action.
The negotiations conducted under the aegis of France and Germany with Ukraine and Russia, right here in this very room. The only meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin on the 9th of December at the end of the year. And Russia, the Kremlin regime once again decided for itself in February 2002 to launch the second stage of this offensive, a full-scale war against Ukraine. And not just the Donbass, because he's not telling us his limits. He regularly bombs Kiev, attacks Odessa, and so on. We have an objective. Russia cannot and must not win this war. For 2 years, we've been helping Ukraine. And if things were to get out of hand, it would once again be...
By the way, that's a pretty definitive statement, but at least it sounds very definitive, and it kind of is. Win depends on the eyes of the beholder. Win is what? Win take back all of Ukraine? Win is stop the Russians from taking over all of Ukraine? Win is maintain an independent Ukraine? Win is assure the Russians will not invade again? What is win? I usually go by the Ukrainian standard of victory, since they are the ones fighting, which is the liberation of the territory and stopping the Russians from invading them again.
Russia's sole responsibility. Russia's responsibility.
And that doesn't mean that there could still be a win. Like, let's say they don't take back everything, but they're able to maintain an independent Ukraine, join NATO, join the EU, and stop another future invasion. Those are wins of a certain style. That's a type of win. They're winning in a certain way. There is a victory inside of that. That would be obvious to anyone who thought, oh, NATO membership, EU membership, never going to happen. But it's still not the win that they wanted, because it's a partial victory or a Pyrrhic victory, whatever you want to call it.
And so if we decide today to be weak, if faced with someone who has no limits, faced with someone who has crossed all the limits he gave us, we naively say to him, I won't go any further than this or that. At that point, we're not deciding peace. We're already deciding defeat.
And you decide to say it, to send it, and that's a very strong gesture to decide to say that we might go that far.
I accept, and I assume it because it's the role of the President of the Republic in our institutions. The President of the Republic is in charge of national defense. He doesn't make comments. He makes decisions for the safety of the French people.
Damn.
What is at stake in Ukraine? A war that is existential for our Europe and for France. I hope we'll come back to it because it's a key issue, subject. And so I've decided, because after 2 years of war, I want to remind you that we have systematically done what we said we weren't going to do, which also puts into perspective the very definitive statements sometimes made by some.
He's referring to, we've systematically done the things we said we weren't going to do. The tanks, medium range missiles, the jets, the Patriots, the Abrams tanks. Remember when we said that was logistically impossible? And apparently that wasn't the case because they're operating it. You know, logistically it would be too difficult. Like, you know, these things we said we wouldn't do, we ended up doing. These things that we thought would be too far of escalation from the start, with Biden trying to stop the MiG-29 transfers, ended up being done with basically zero repercussions. But the Russians were able to, through an attempt of, you know, I would just say saber rattling, to delay us in our deliveries of this equipment and undermined that flow of equipment early on. If we could have got that equipment to them sooner and in larger quantities, and we were less worried about it, maybe it could have had a more decisive impact on the battlefield. We'll never know. That's an alternative history for all of you internet nerds, TNO, Hoi 4 players. But that's not the world we live in. But we have to live with that decision. But the Biden administration, you know, inheriting the George Kennan version of diplomacy with the Russians, of course, is worried about the fact that they have a nuclear arsenal and wants to engage in brinksmanship that keeps the country safe, which, while of course in this instance led to some decisions, definitely by people like Jake Sullivan, if you're in his camp, that were pretty frustrating. But I do just want to throw out there, I am happy that there's a president that's more considerate towards that and what that would mean than his predecessor.
People across Europe. 2 years ago, we said we'd never send a tank. We did. 2 years ago, we said we would never send medium-range missiles. We did. We said we'd never send planes. Some are in the process of doing so. So, we've put too many limits, if I may say so, on our vocabulary. We're not escalating. We are not at war with Russia. Quite simply, we must be clear. We must not let Russia win.
But the French haven't understood, you were talking about vocabulary, under what precise, concrete conditions French soldiers would go to fight in Ukraine. Was it because the Russian army would make a decisive breakthrough on the front line? Is it because a key city, Odessa, for example, is about to fall? You weren't specific on that.
But perhaps I'm right not to be precise, and I'll say it again.
But the two conditions I've just mentioned are either science fiction or possible scenarios.
In your eyes. For some years now, we've all been living in a world where what we thought unthinkable is happening. This is the end of the carefree attitude I mentioned a few years ago. This is it. War is on European soil. Between Strasbourg and Lviv, less than 1,500 kilometers. Just imagine war is in this country. So it's not a fiction and it's not far from us. So all these options are possible. The only one...
I do want to throw out there, Germans, 8 billion this year. French, 3 billion. I'm just saying, now in this speech, I know he later commits to building 75 Caesar artillery systems for Ukraine, which I would assume if they're building those, they would also build gun barrel replacements, more important. Helping them with maintenance is an advantage that we could give the Ukrainians over the Russians, as the Russians are using older and older Soviet equipment that's going to require more maintenance. And while, of course, a lot of the Soviet equipment is made so the dumbest village idiot could use it, they aren't impermeable, like impossible to break down over years and years of storage. So hopefully it would come with gun barrel replacements. But I think a lot of this diplomatic overture, whatever you want to, this diplomatic signaling that he's doing, would get more credibility if he put his money where his mouth was on a larger scale, at least somewhat comparable to the Germans as a percentage of GDP. Because if you look at the Kiel Institute tracker, the French are like near where the Italians are as to contributions to Ukraine as a percentage of GDP. Now, the French will counter and say, well, you're not including our EU contributions. But even if you account for that, you would also have to account for other nations like Germany's EU contributions, and then their donations go from 8 billion even higher. And then you're still on the lower end of the spectrum GDP. And, you know, Denmark has given a ton as a percentage of GDP. A ton. Or a really large amount. Their last aid package was bigger than our last aid package. We did 300 million, going through our couch cushions, trying to find what we could send to Ukrainians, taking our arms contract sales savings and using that over years, collecting it together to do one aid package. The Danish do 330 million, 24 hours within that. Beat us. So I think that the French, if they want to make this more credible, should put what's the phrase? Your money where your mouth is.
One who will take responsibility is the Kremlin.
That's not they've dedicated 3 billion. That's something. It's just if they want to take this rhetorical stance, it would be better if the checkbooks matched it and the assistance to Ukraine matched the rhetoric.
Kremlin regime. It won't be us. We will never go on the offensive. We will never take the initiative. France is a force for peace. But today, to have peace in Ukraine, we must not be weak. And so we have to look at the situation lucidly and say, with determination, will, and courage, that we are ready to do whatever it takes to achieve our objective, which is that Russia should not win.
If we're ready, it's because we're getting ready. That means right now...
In the beginning, we're getting ready.
That means we're training for air operations or...
But France on the ground...
On the ground?
France didn't wait until February 2002 to get ready. We have a complete army model, a deterrent force and operational armies. And I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute once again to our soldiers and their families. We are one of the few countries in Europe that for 10 years has had forces deployed in the Sahel to fight terrorism. And we have lost dozens of men there.
But for you, it wasn't the same kind of fight.
But did we think it was?
Got the
we were fighting issues. We were fighting enemies. Terrorists who were...
Domestic enemies too.
At the request of a state to prevent a sovereign state from collapsing and to protect our outposts. But do we think it's more incidental? Today, it's not necessary in Ukraine. But does that mean we should rule out everything? What I mean is that we're ready. That's why I decided in my first term of office, and right from the start, a considerable increase in the budget for our armed forces, which means that the 2 military programming laws that I would have had to decide as president would have led to a doubling of the budget for our armed forces. So we're not waking up on this subject. I'd just like to clarify one point. What has happened over the last few months is a profound change, and the leap forward that I called for on February 16, alongside President Zelensky here, and which led me to say this, but above all to decide on very concrete things with our allies, is that the Ukrainian...
Privacy got a Tier 1 subscription. Hot take. I consider that sending NATO into Ukraine isn't as risky as many think. Mutual destruction is only worth it if one has nothing to lose.
Russia's huge. Well, this is the thing, is like, in brinksmanship, if people knew that their move would lead to the destruction of both states, then they wouldn't take it. If somebody has the last opportunity to turn and they're gonna turn, for example, let's say that they're like person A really hates person B and they're speeding at high speeds on the highway, and person B is parked out in the middle of the road, and they could swerve to get out of the way, but they're playing chicken. And so the person B, they're parked though. Their car brake is in, their keys are out, they're in their pocket. And so they turn and they decide not to do anything, to just stare at the car, thinking that the car speeding towards them will see that and therefore will swerve. Now, whether or not the person driving towards them at high speeds knows it, the person parked, even if at the last moment they decide they want to move out of the way, it might be too late because they're parked, they have to start the car. For example, someone could launch nuclear weapons, and then it could be too late. It's out of human control. Even if you find out it's a human error and that it wasn't an actual attack, you might not be able to stop it. And so if that person speeding towards that car knows that they have the last opportunity, they're going to swerve out of the way in order to avoid it, because they know that they will both die, that they will achieve the goal of taking out person B, but that also means person A's destruction. The problem with this, though, is if I told you guys to go park in the middle of the highway because no one would be dumb enough to crash into you because they might die, you're not going to do it, are you? Because you know that we're dealing with human beings, and whether or not no one would make the logical conclusion to take their car and ram it into somebody else, human error, technical malfunctions, all sort of stuff could get in the way to make it so you mess up and your brinksmanship on the highway leads to you both being dead. Let me give you an example. Let's say that you up your nuclear readiness level during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of your submarines gets a reading that says, oh, it looks like we've been attacked. It's time to launch the nukes. And then they launch the nukes. Now, the leader A and leader B never intended for that to happen, but because that submarine thought they lost communication with Moscow or lost communication with Washington, they've engaged, they fired. That brinksmanship, which neither state intended to lead to the destruction of to the start of a nuclear war because of its destructive capacity. That's the thing about brinksmanship. Some people just view it like, oh, well, this is just the threat. It's either all or nothing of the threat of annihilation. Either they're going to choose to annihilate or not choose to annihilate. The threat of human error, the threat of a mistake, the threat of two jets slamming into each other, the threat of some misfire or some human error entering the situation and causing a catastrophe is a deterrent in and of itself. That's why the Chinese will break down communications with their armed forces, because there used to be peer-to-peer military communication so they don't ram into each other. During a diplomatic incident where they're particularly angry at us, like during the Nancy Pelosi visit to Taiwan, they'll stop communicating to our armed forces. Now, does that increase the risk of one of our ships ramming into their ships? Exactly. It's the same reason why I think we need to have some military-to-military communication with the North Koreans, since they are a nuclear power. Now, sorry, I lost my train of thought for a second. But the threat of something going wrong could be enough to make someone pull out. So the Chinese, for example, stop that peer-to-peer communication. We don't want to deal with the risk of brinksmanship going out of control or something happening. So then maybe we'll back off of whatever caused this incident, because even though we know that they would never make the decision to destroy us, we also know that some factors are outside of their control once they up the nuclear readiness level and a mistake happens. They can't control for every Chinese soldier to do the right thing in the situation. We can't control for every American soldier. We can't control for the complete perfectness of our communication systems, or of our radar systems, or of the judgment of our political leaders, or the judgment of those on the ground who are determined if they're under attack or not. For example, let's say one of us we or they do a nuclear attack, and this is an issue that I know Henry Kissinger talked about and other people talked about, and that is if you do a small nuclear attack, then it might not have enough deterrent potential, and that could actually have the opposite effect of deterrence. But if you do too large of an attack and an incident where you actually had to use nuclear weapons to say, this is a red line, don't go any further, this could mean annihilation, which could logically cause the Russians to back off, they could read it, if it's too large, or depending on its size, or who knows how, as a general attack. If our intention was just to nuke one city to send a message like you will not take Berlin or something, or nuke one base to send that message, if they come to the conclusion, or come to the mistaken conclusion, that this isn't a singular attack, this is a major attack, this is a big attack, this nuclear war started, then they could launch everything, even though our intent was to show that if they take a step forward, it will mean annihilation. And then they think, well, annihilation has already arrived, so let's get it over with. Let's try to take them out first. So there's so many different examples of human error and how that can play in here. And so while I agree that the Russians consciously making the decision to destroy, to engage in a full-scale nuclear war with all of NATO, does it make sense? And they almost certainly wouldn't make that decision unless they were run by maniacs, complete maniacs, people who don't even value their own wealth and prosperity, because that will almost certainly be annihilated. And I don't think Putin's mansion would survive. There's the risk of unintentional escalation during brinksmanship. Okay, sorry, that was kind of a rant, but I wanted to explain why it's not good to escalate these scenarios, even if you know it's in both of your interests not to start a nuclear war. People have stumbled into wars before. It was not in the interest in the vast majority of the people participating in World War I to fight that war. They did it anyway because they fell into it. Well, partially, but that's one explanation.
Counteroffensive has not gone as expected over the last few months. And when you look at the situation over the last few weeks, it's a difficult situation on the ground for the Ukrainians. That's an understatement. That's an understatement. Some experts say that I'm not being defeatist, but it's difficult. They're brave, once again. But they have limits. They have limits in terms of men. Because Russia is a bigger country, and as soon as there are only Ukrainian men, they have this limit, and they lose a lot of them. And they have a limit in terms of shells and missiles, because just about now, when Russia fires 10 shells, we respond with 1. So you can see that the situation on the front is very fragile. And next to that, you have a regime in the Kremlin that has hardened profoundly.
Because what's the difference?
All these last months, and I would say in gradation, the informational and cyber attacks, including in our daily lives on hospitals in France and elsewhere in Europe, which has hardened by deciding to kill political opponents.
But this is nothing
Alexei
new.
Lavalette, but I'm not saying it's us. I'm saying it's intensifying.
But the alarm could have been sounded earlier. That's what I mean.
You can't blame me for sounding the alarm too early, and you can't blame me for sounding it earlier. I believe that as I look at the situation with a clear head, we have done everything we could beyond sounding the alarm to be demanding. But the agreements with President Putin, the clear head that I am evoking in front of you, I have been wearing since the June of June in Versailles, saying, you're attacking us. You're manipulating our data. I was a victim of this in my first campaign. So we need to establish respect and stop you being a destabilizing force. I'll say it again in 2008, in 2009. But back then, we wanted to avoid war. Then there was the time when we helped Ukraine to resist. But now the situation on the ground in Ukraine is changing. The situation is much more difficult for them. Russia is getting tougher at home and stepping up its attacks. And so, yes, I say to you with the utmost solemnity, this beginning of the year, 2024, must be, for us, one of startup.
If we send soldiers over there, forgive me for remaining in this gloomy scenario, there'll be infantrymen, conscripts and airmen.
Okay, so we don't talk about it. But first of all, I don't wish it. I want Russia to stop this war, withdraw from its positions and allow peace. But you no longer believe that. But what's important here is, firstly, it's not my wish. But secondly, I'm not going to give visibility to someone who doesn't give it to me. That's a question for President Putin. Come on. But he asked me where I thought the number was today.
Your Minister of the Armed Forces gave us some visibility. He said, no, we're not sending any men over there.
We don't know.
It may be minors.
We don't know.
That's what we expected.
I can tell you this because he made a distinction between what was decided and what we're putting in place and what we shouldn't exclude because we'll adapt. We have decided, last February 26 in Paris, to go further in helping Ukraine, to set up a coalition to supply them with missiles or bombs that will enable them to hit Russia alone.
By the way, the 800,000 shells that the Czechs were trying to fundraise for, they succeeded. And now they're getting more shells. They're getting more shells on top of that, and new countries are still contributing to it. There's a good, if they keep it up, they might get well over, like, they really keep it up. I hope they keep going until they get over like 1 million shells, just keep going and going and going. The French said that if they were unable to produce enough shells domestically in the European market in order to supply the Ukraine's defense, they weren't able to get to the 1 million. So they missed it, that they would open up to the international market because they wanted, the French wanted all this money that's being spent on these foreign shells to be spent in Europe to build up the defense production. But he said that he would make an exception if they missed their target. So they missed their target, and now it looks like they are doing that. They are buying outside of the union, and that's good. They should have done it before. I don't see why you can't both buy from the international market and invest domestically. That's what they're doing now. They could have done that before as well and gotten to these shells to Ukraine sooner. But, you know, what's done is done.
But never Russia. But to reach behind Russian positions today. We also decided...
Oh, it wasn't just the French, by the way. It was the French, the Cypriots, and the Greeks.
We also decided to speed up our search for ammunition wherever it was available. That's what I went to Prague to do a few days later, and we decided to carry out 5 joint actions. And we all agreed around this table, Europeans, Americans, Canadians, Brits, to say we're going to clear mines together. produce and repair equipment, deploy civilian forces on the border with Belarus, protect the border with Moldavia, again with civilian forces, and defensive cyber actions on Ukrainian soil.
Man, that would be interesting, because that would mean it would be French troops, and people who draft dodge, they go over the border into Moldova more often than not. People do it also in Romania, but Moldova seems to be one of the big options. That would mean French troops or French civilian contractors or French police, whatever it would be, they would be the one that would be in charge of containing that. Man, I mean, it certainly would at least put some more manpower available to the Ukrainians. Again, this would be one of the ways to supplement the Ukrainian manpower shortage without putting troops directly on the front line.
On the other hand, they have not decided to send any troops at all. And they let you know as soon as you said that.
We can always come back to that, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it.
That's what the French are asking.
But they're absolutely right. But I say today, we've decided on this, and it's a change. We decided it in Paris. It's the start of a new awakening. Then, I tell you, we'll do what's necessary to achieve our goal. Because if Russia were to win, French people's lives would change. How would it change? We would no longer have security in Europe. Who can think for a second that President Putin, who has not respected any and commitments, would stop there?
What's happening in Ukraine today also affects France's vital interests. There is a danger,
but the security of
France,
Europe and the security of the French are at stake over there. And these are our vital interests. You're using a term that has particular connotations. I say security.
And you yourself have used the term existential threat.
But
that means it's our very existence that's at stake in the game.
Say it, and I assume it. We've already suffered the consequences of this war in our daily lives. We've already suffered these attacks. Many of our hospitals have already suffered days and days of dysfunction due to Russian aggression. We've already suffered the consequences in Europe. The price of gas.
So if you're confused, he's talking about cyber attacks, for those who are unaware.
The situation of our economy, the cost of cereals, the economic upheavals that have followed are the consequence of this war launched by Russia. And if Russia wins this war, Europe's credibility will be reduced to zero. Will be reduced to zero. What would be the credibility on our soil of a power, the European Union, of its members who let this happen? What would be the security of Europeans? Do you think that the Poles, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Latvians, the Romanians, the Bulgarians could remain at peace for a second? And I'm not even talking about Moldavia, which may not be in the European Union today, but which would be threatened in a second.
You're saying it in a nutshell.
I say it's happening.
Putin won't stop there. If he wins this war, he'll continue elsewhere. He'll find other prey.
By
us.
Is
that what you're saying?
But by our past. We've already seen regimes that killed opponents at home, had authoritarian tendencies, and were determined to conquer everything they were allowed to conquer.
So Putin wouldn't stop there if he won this war.
But I think what I'm saying is a complete consensus from President Biden to the German Chancellor, everything.
All the leaders of
what
Europe,
I'm saying
so
here,
only our force, French, European, NATO, I don't know, can stop it. And it has to be stopped in Ukraine.
Today we need to have, to borrow an old Churchill phrase, the nerve of peace. To want peace is not to choose defeat. To want peace today is not to abandon Ukraine. Is it to wage war?
That's what they're asking you to do.
No. It's to be credible, to be strong and ready. To adapt to whatever choice Russia makes. And so, if war were to spread to Europe, it would be Russia's sole choice and sole responsibility.
Fake Alec Kyle Parker has donated $25.
Hey!
I feel like I am watching an episode of West Wing.
It's interesting. Look, I like being able to, dude, I hope they do this in the future. Having AI just translate stuff real quick, being able to get this stuff out so when a foreign leader makes a speech, I can listen to his words. Direct. Again, translators are still going to be the better option for a long time, but once that's an option, it's going to be so much better. And it means that I don't have to rely on a certain outlet to tell me what words of a certain speech was important. For example, in this speech, Macron at one point talks about the need for Ukraine to take back Crimea for peace. Now, a lot of headlines didn't talk about it. The only headline that did, that brought it up directly, was Pravda. And of course, a Ukrainian, a Ukrainian outlet, Eastern European outlet. But because I was able to listen to it in English, I was like, oh, okay, I can get that information directly. I don't need to rely on the Washington Post to tell me. I like that. Definitely as a person who, talks about a lot of foreign conflicts.
But to decide today to be weak, to decide today.
And you'll be surprised by how many outlets will just stream a foreign, like on an English-speaking outlet, they don't want to pay for the translator, so they just stream the speech in its original language. I've seen that happen before. And it's just, they'll get like a few hundred viewers, not like half of them don't know what's happening. The other half speak the language and they're just using this as the source. But it's terrible. Yeah. But it doesn't happen that often, but it is annoying.
That we would not respond is already defeat. Sir, don't say it.
Why can't you say so?
I don't want you to. But contrary to what you'd like to believe, many of my counterparts have followed my lead. A few days later, I was in Prague, and next to me was the president. Czech said exactly the same thing. You had the Lithuanian president here a few days ago, he said himself. All options must be open. He even obtained a mandate from his parliament to send.
That means you've convinced them.
But things are moving. But as we've done every time, in February 2082, in March 2082, in Versailles, we decided on a strategic agenda, the agenda for Europe's strategic autonomy. It's still called the Versailles Agenda. It is still valid, and we have been in the vanguard. We debated the possibility of recognizing Ukraine's application to join the European Union. Not many people were there. 2 months later, I took the train to Kiev with Chancellor Scholz, Prime Minister Draghi, and the President of Romania. Zelensky, that we were for it, and we decided at the next council meeting that this would be the case. Things are moving. We simply have to. And because it's my responsibility, do I want to give you the finger? My responsibility is the security of the French people and national defense. And our security is also at stake in Ukraine today.
By the way, today, March 24, is the Russian regime, Vladimir Putin's regime, France's enemy?
He is the adversary.
What is the semantic nuance between adversary and enemy?
We are not at war with Russia.
Yeah, but it is waging war on us. So you want it to be
We're attacking on a cyber level, yes.
But it's a form of war. Russian agents hired by Russia, who are Moldovans, tagged photos of David in Paris.
You're right to say all that, which is a hybrid form. But we have to be careful not to qualify them immediately, because otherwise we'd be ourselves.
What would it take for you to say the word enemy? What would sympathy
But if Russia were to escalate again, dragging us all into a conflict, I wish with all my might that it wouldn't. But for sure, today we're in a situation where we can't afford to lose. But today, Russia is certainly an adversary. The Kremlin regime is an adversary, but I've always said it. We are not waging war against Russia and the Russian people. And we support Ukraine. We are doing everything we can to help it defeat Russia. Russia in check because, let me put it very simply, there can be no lasting peace if there isn't sovereignty and a return to the internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. But it's up to the Ukrainians to decide. It's up to them to negotiate.
To discuss it.
And you're right to say so.
After all.
It's theirs.
You're right.
It's their
country.
It
is their country. It's got internationally recognized.
But what I'm saying is that there will be no security and no lasting peace if it's not the fruit of negotiation led by the Ukrainians. But there will be no security for the French if there is no peace there.
You say it's not allowed.
Peace doesn't mean Ukraine's capitulation, nor the amputation of Ukraine, because all that is already choosing that we are weak. So
no amputation of Ukraine. What do you think that means? By the way, what a great way to put it, by the way. The amputation of Ukraine.
No Chump Change gifted 40 Tier 1 subscriptions. One big on the slots. Take some money.
You
Gamble
won on
all
the
your money away,
slots?
kids. You only lose if you stop.
You won on the slots? You won on the slots? Oh my goodness, 40 Tier 1 subs. That's a lot of subs. That's a lot of subs. I don't think I've been gifted that much. So I think that's the biggest sub dono of the year this year so far. My goodness. Man, you must be very skillful at the slot machine. You must know how to really pull that lever. 40, gifted. Man, well, congratulations on winning on the slots, and congratulations to me to having a fan that won at the slots. I thank you. I appreciate that. My goodness, that is a lot. Wowza. Thank you. I appreciate it.
France's position has
been 40. That's a lot. I got to go do the math.
Been very consistent from the outset. It's just that Russia is escalating. And to this escalation, we must say that we are ready to respond.
Would Russia be
Hey, man, I appreciate it. Sorry. Continuing. Just, man, 40.
Capable of targeting you? You recently canceled the visit to Ukraine for security reasons.
Not at all.
Yeah, no, they said it could have been for security reasons, but that was just speculation. We haven't heard anybody say. So for those of you who don't know, Zelensky and the Italian prime minister were in Odessa, very close, like 800 meters or something away from a strike, 300, some crazy close distance. And there's no evidence that it was deliberate targeting. We don't know, but there was some speculation. And so some people then saw that he had to cancel a meeting, Macron, and connected the two, but that had never been formally connected, and it was all speculation. But we don't know.
That's what obviously...
That's what Russia said. Don't believe them. You know, Russia... It's interesting because public debate is permeated by Russian misinformation. They made people believe it. Many people are now convinced. The subject of ground troops has entered the public debate. One of your colleagues asked me this question, because the Slovak prime minister, who is very close to Russia says that our secret plan is to send ground troops, and we react every time. We close doors, we hunker down. No. So I postponed my trip. Why did you do that? Because President Zelensky was coming to Europe for the Munich Security Conference. So I suggested that he come here to sign the bilateral agreement. And then I told him, on the strength of the very long discussion we'd had and the lucid assessment I've just made, I told him, in essence, my usefulness, rather than being at your side in Kiev, is to implement this leap of faith, to convince the Europeans and our allies to go further. What we have done here, the 26, with these new initiatives that have been taken, is to try to go further, and precisely to make everyone realize that things are changing, and changing fast, and not in the right direction. And that's what I'll be taking to Berlin tomorrow, where I'll be meeting Chancellor Scholz and the Polish Prime Minister.
Almost every week, Russian President Vladimir Putin brandishes the nuclear threat in a clear and threatening manner. France is the only member of the European Union to have nuclear weapons. Do you, or should we, feel particularly targeted?
First and foremost, we need to feel particularly protected, precisely because we are this endowed power.
Except that he mentions France a lot.
And that this is the very meaning of the choice made by General de Gaulle after the Second World War. And then we are ready. We have an established doctrine. And
for those of you who don't know, it was General de Gaulle that pushed France to pursue a nuclear program and got them a nuclear program. France to this day continues to maintain a small nuclear arsenal of, I believe, my mind says between 50 to 200 nukes. I forget the exact number.
And when it comes to nuclear power, you don't need many words. And nuclear power is not an instrument of destabilization or threat. It's an instrument of security.
And the fact that we have the bomb, as Russia does, places us in a special confrontation, giving France a greater responsibility or greater weight, depending on your point of view.
First and foremost, our nuclear capability provides security for the French people, which few countries in the world have. It gives us a responsibility to be a power with this weapon, and therefore to never escalate, either verbally or, of course, de facto.
And yet he brandishes...
Tech, thank you so much for the tier 1 sub and gutter chat. Appreciate it, buddy.
...the threat.
I don't think it's...
echoes your words about red lines.
...appropriate when we... nuclear weapons...
You haven't spoken to Putin in how long?
Several months.
Isn't it a handicap not to speak to him?
Look, I've talked to him. I've spoken to him whenever necessary.
In fact, there's even been more footage published recently of Macron, like, talking to, I don't know if it was published recently or just got to the circles recently, because it all looks like footage I think I've seen before. But there's footage of Macron out on the web. You can go find it now if you want, of him talking as the invasion is ongoing and is starting, as he tries to do everything he can to convince Putin to turn around and to stop this. And he really does try. He's an intermediary between Zelensky, and he tries to set up something, and it didn't work. And you can see it looks like a genuine effort as the troops cross the border. And I have no reason to believe that it wasn't a genuine effort. They had all reason to believe that Ukraine, put under pressure for the Russian armed forces, very well could fall.
I've talked to her, obviously hundreds of hours, before February 2022, at length between February and April 2022, to try to stop this war and negotiate peace. But from the moment he himself no longer respected any framework, in other words, contrary to what he had said, he was not carrying out a special operation, which we had already condemned, and that he had no legal framework, no legitimacy, no legality, but that he would attack Kiev, which was carrying out war crimes. The discussion no longer made sense. We're going to go on like we did in September. Then there were occasional discussions on the nuclear issue, because we had taken the initiative because of the front line in conjunction with the International Atomic Energy Agency to do everything we could to protect this plant. And so I had the exchanges at that time. But discussions, I'm perfectly willing to have them at any time. But we still need to be dealing with someone who is telling the truth and whose intention is to make peace. And that's not the case today.
And in your opinion, Vladimir Putin is a Russian patriot? Is he an autocrat? Is he a dictator? Everything you've been saying for the last 2 minutes, the crimes he's committing against civilians, we look in a dictionary, we say to ourselves that only an autocrat or a dictator can commit crimes against civilians.
Today, I'm not a commentator. The president of the Russian Federation, who today is caught up in a drift.
Personal or repressive.
And authoritarian drift in his country, and has chosen in recent years to be a power of destabilization, to be a destabilizing power in Europe. In Europe, by launching a war for which it bears sole responsibility and threatening the security of all.
Facts, I spit facts, muted facts that you'll never hear.
But in many other theaters of operation, from the Near and Middle East to the Caucasus and Africa, Russia is a destabilizing power.
You don't talk to her anymore, so it won't be you who negotiates peace with him. Who will? Will it be the United States?
But there is an order of times. I'm probably the most talked about leader in terms of responsibility.
Yes, but now let's say there's a certain coldness between you.
But it's not a cold, things aren't personal. And besides, I don't want to try and personalize them. It wouldn't make any sense.
Why are things so cold? Why are things so cold between you and the guy that invaded Ukraine?
This isn't fiction. It's not a novel or a series.
And don't worry.
We're talking about life and death.
Didn't you guys just have brunch? Why can't you just have brunch again?
As far as I'm informed, I don't feel that Donald Trump is president of the United States of America.
There's a risk.
And so today it's clear there's not a risk, there's war. As we speak, men and women are dying in Ukraine by President Putin.
By the way, he just said that he doesn't think Trump's going to be president of America again. Just throw that out there. It just kind of flew out there, and it kind of breezed through it very quickly. I just wanted to identify that Macron gave his official 2024 prediction, which is Trump loses.
Putin. And what I'm telling you is that if Ukraine falls, our security is threatened. And so the time has come for us to resist. And we're in a time, and this is the time I'm taking on, to say that if Russia were to continue its escalation, if the situation were to deteriorate, we have to be ready. And we will be ready.
And to be ready.
And we will be ready.
And
we'll be ready to
necessary.
make the decisions to ensure.
Again, he can be ready, and just the fact that he's ready, even if he never intends to use it or would never even use it if the Russians went on Kiev, the fact that he's ready and the Russians have to see that hard power, then that has more diplomatic weight when he tries to apply pressure to either make the Russians stop or accept a certain deal. Now, of course, the Russians could just decide to blare on forward and call him on his bluff, but that does, you know, most weapons are never fired, and the effect that they have on the geopolitical stage is diplomatic, as in being the hard coercive power that backs up a state during its diplomatic overtures. And so even if he doesn't deploy troops out there, that could be the influence that those troops have, even if they're never deployed. And so what I'm saying is, even if he hasn't deployed troops, by him going out here and saying this, even if he never would, it could give diplomatic pressure more weight. And I think it does. I think the fact that he's sticking on it so much is giving it more weight. But I think if he really wants to give it as much weight as possible, he has to go further, like I said earlier, and increase aid shipments and make it so, again, puts his money where his mouth is.
Sure that Russia never wins.
Which is why you said that France is in a war economy.
Will come and will come, I hope, as soon as possible, the moment when we will have to speak again with the president of the Russian Federation, whoever he may be, when the time comes.
And France is in a war economy, you said at the beginning of the year. You were talking about shells earlier. Take a look at the figures with Anne-Sophie. As we speak, France is producing less than 100 shells a day, unless we're mistaken. That's what Ukrainian soldiers are using. Use in a few minutes. Sorry, it's very modest, but it's the most we can do.
It's modest, and it's quite normal for these categories because we don't have a defense industry that's adapted to an ever-increasing demand.
The interviewer is right, by the way.
We don't have a defense industry that is adapted to a war of high territorial intensity, which is not in any of our forecasts and which we are not preparing to wage for ourselves. Will it ever be? And so, several things. Firstly, as early as February 2022, I declared to all industrialists that we were moving into a wartime economy. I asked them to make an effort to produce more and to produce faster. And that's what I entrusted to the Minister of the Armed Forces at that time. We got the job done on several segments that were essential for the Ukrainians. Caesar cannons, which are crucial to Ukraine's defense.
75 new ones.
We increased their production. And where we have delivered a few dozen since the beginning of the conflict this year, because we have multiplied the lines and increased production rates, we are going to produce almost 75 Caesar cannons, all of which will go to the Ukrainian front. That's a lot more than we've delivered since the beginning. We have more than tripled our production. Categories of shells and missiles that are relevant to the Ukrainians. But there are limits, and this is true of all European countries. So what do we do about it? We're increasing our capacities and production rates, but above all, it's taking time because we have to create new lines and new production structures. That's why we decided to create them in Ukraine, because it's closer to the field and can be done much faster. That's what we decided here with all our partners, and that's what we're going to do hand in hand with Germany.
Expose you to bombardment.
That's been agreed. You underline a form of contradiction, perhaps, among some of my partners who are ready to produce them on Ukrainian soil, but not ready to make certain commitments for the future. Well, that'll come.
We could be French engineers, but our questions
we're in the
are
process
for
of looking into,
Muslims.
within the framework of these coalitions, the deployments we'll be making in Ukraine to co-produce with them. This will help us to move ahead more quickly. And finally, we're doing two other things, one in the short term and one in the medium term. That's what war economics is all about. In the short term, we look for ammunition wherever it's available. So we're going to sound out every country in the world. I won't mention their names here because for some, confidentiality is important. But we'll search their available stock and offer to buy from them because it's a question of speed. At the same time, we're putting the European defense industry in a position to produce much more in the long term.
How do you finance it? Because we're having a bit of a budgetary problem at the moment. We're making a lot of savings.
Indian shells might be getting bought up, by the way. That could be one of the purchasers that they're doing. I don't know. I know that there was a scandal about Indian shells kind of showing up in Ukraine. It was like, oh, how'd those get there? And there's some pictures posted that shouldn't have been posted. And ooh. So they might be the ones that are helping the supply. They don't know. A lot of these sellers are private. And many of them probably want to keep it private.
Yes, but
Billions.
because...
How do we finance this whole war effort?
But first of all, I'm going to be very frank with our compatriots and with you. We can't say that we've all been doing it for 2 years. And we've been saying it. All European leaders have been saying it. All of them. There's no exception. Our future is at stake in this war. This war is existential. And to say we're going to carry on living as if nothing had happened. No, but I'm telling you, that's not possible.
How we finance...
So, as I'm telling you, we've already anticipated the situation since we have a military programming law that comes after the other one. We have doubled our disarmament budget. On top of that, we've been making budgetary choices since 2002. On top of that, we're financing aid to Ukraine.
And
we've already financed 4.8 billion euros, more or less, and we're going to go up to 3 billion euros this year. And then
again, compare that relative to the other powers that have somewhat similar GDP to France. They can contribute more. They can contribute more. 3 billion isn't that impressive in comparison to the Germans.
Our European commitment. That's what...
It's something. You know, I prefer 3 billion than no billion, but they can do more.
Why we've launched a European peace facility. It will be approved next week by the European Council. and it provides for the award of contracts to our defense industrialists to produce on our soil, produce more armaments for us, for our eastern flank, and for Ukraine. And we're going to use this money. We're also going to use the money we have in the investment program to go and produce in Ukraine with the Ukrainians. So Europe is also mobilizing alongside our national investment. And on top of that, we shouldn't exclude the possibility of that we'll have to make additional decisions as Europeans. Additional decisions in Europe, and
in other words,
i.e. to decide to finance new initiatives.
With loans?
And I don't rule it out. And I think that what we were able to do during the COVID period, which was to say we're facing a shock, this pandemic, we're all affected. And we need to raise money together on the markets, putting our signature on the table. That's what kept us going. And that's what enabled us to get back on our feet. Personally, I think that if the needs were to be greater, and this is a proposal that has been made by the Prime Minister of Estonia, not a French proposal, but I subscribe to it. And so I think that what I want you to understand from the start of our conversation, and basically for the last 10 days, and what I want our compatriots to understand, there is only one party responsible for the situation we find ourselves in. It's the Kremlin regime. But we have a responsibility, and I say this in all conscience as President of the Republic.
Do you want
it is, I tell you
because
conscientiously, but it will never be. Have you seen the polls?
Have you seen the polls? The support has continued, but
war in Ukraine. You know, we've been through it at other times in our history. It's always much easier to go and sing nursery rhymes to people. I could tell you tonight, because it's not popular. You know, it's a long way off. We're for peace. We're for peace. The people who say that today, the same people who don't want to support Ukraine, by the way, they're not choosing peace.
Who are you talking about?
They're choosing defeat. A few days ago, they chose to give up their sovereignty because they chose right now to say that we have limits. And so, to the one who, until now, has had none, has taken all the responsibility for aggression, we'll let you move forward because we're afraid.
Because they fear your fear. Who are you talking about?
And those in France?
Ukraine. But at last?
Well, very clearly, have decided not to support Ukraine.
Mr. President, a few days ago, the Senate and the National Assembly had to vote on a security agreement you signed with the Ukrainian president. Several political parties abstained or voted against. The National Assembly abstained, and the Communist Party and France Insoumise voted against. What do you think of their position? They're pacifists and have every right to be. They are instruments of the Kremlin, useful idiots, as we might have said a few decades ago.
No. I've always tried to keep the country united, right from the start. The meetings.
Okay, but they are useful idiots. You can use whatever rhetoric you want as the president of France, but they are useful idiots.
I held in Saint-Denis. I did.
Maybe a few of them are paid idiots. I don't know.
So again, when I saw all the party leaders and the presidents of the constitutional assemblies were held a few months ago. Constitutional assemblies a few days ago. And after that, it's freedom, it's political pluralism. So we have to be respectful of that. But I have a very profound disagreement. I think that today, in good conscience, choosing to abstain or to vote against support for Ukraine is not choosing peace, it's choosing defeat. And that's very different.
And when they accuse you of instrumentalizing the
conflict, 100% put that line through like some PR tester or something, like, we're going to say this line today. Yeah, I think this line works. I think this line works.
Conflict in Ukraine.
When you hear somebody say the same line again, they wanted to say it. They wrote it down. They threw it by some people.
We've already had this debate.
In the service of
We've already had this debate. Finally, because the last presidential election was held a few months after the start of the February conflict in Sea. Listen to this. You can't be serious. That's all I can say. It's not serious because the responsibility for this war, the responsibility for the blows to the Ukrainian front, is Russia's alone. Our responsibility is to be strong for peace. Our responsibility is to hold this European unity together. And every time we have achieved European unity, from the outset, we were under the French presidency, and we'll get it, you'll see. it's about holding on to our unity, but it's also about being strong. It means being strong to deter. It means being strong to resist. It's about being strong for our security.